Whether your career philosophy is that you live to work or if you work to live, your health and safety should never be sacrificed for productivity. Whatever your position, laborer, supervisor, technician, safety officer, machine operator, or any other role, you must become aware of the hazards involved in your work and the strategies required to ensure safe work and respond to emergencies. Every task comes with its own set of risks. Think about your own work environment. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty. Over the course of this training, we will discuss OSHA's Focus 4 hazards and top 10 standard violations, and how to communicate, protect against, and respond to these hazards. This will include lockout-tagout procedures, principles of working safely with machines and tools, and a basic introduction to safe work tactics for forklift and heavy equipment operation. We will also discuss how to protect yourself from injuries through proper interaction with your work environment and use of personal protective equipment. Finally, you will learn about fire prevention and response, basic first aid, and how to protect yourself from bloodborne pathogens. As we progress, reflect on how each aspect of safety relates to your own work environment and tasks. If you are unsure, ask your supervisor about the hazards you are likely to face in your specific position. This information should readily be available. Have you ever heard of OSHA's Focus 4? Sometimes known as the Fatal 4, these hazards encompass the most common causes of workplace injuries and death. These are falls, caught in or caught between scenarios, incidents where a worker is struck by a machine, object, or material, and electrocution. They are based primarily around the construction environment, but these Focus 4 are applicable to other settings. If you work in agriculture, industrial settings, transportation, emergency response services, or any other setting that involves heights or the use of or exposure to machinery, tools, or electricity, you are at heightened risk of harm from the Fatal 4. Although OSHA is recognized most for its enforcement of safe work standards through hefty fines and other penalties, the emphasis is always on prevention. It is preferable to train workers on how to work safely to avoid violations and, of course, injuries, illnesses, or fatalities. As part of this mission, OSHA annually publicizes a list of the top 10 violations from the previous year. Depending on your own field experience, you may be able to guess what some of the top violations are. Think about it and then check yourself against this list. A typical top 10 citations list from OSHA includes lack of or poorly utilized fall protection, lack of or improperly used respiratory protection, ladder use violations, poor, incorrect, or absent hazard communication, scaffolding violations, improper, insufficient, or omitted fall protection training, various violations involving poor control of hazardous energy, such as lockout-tagout procedures, violations involving eye and face protection, citations involving the use of powered industrial trucks, and unsafe work practices involving machinery, such as poor or non-existent machine guarding. Each item on the list has its own published standard and a link to resources aimed at helping workers stay safe and avoid these hazards. Since citations are typically levied against a company, not an employee, an emphasis is placed on employer responsibility. Make no mistake, although everyone is responsible for safety in the workplace, liability almost always rests with the employer. That is one reason why it is so important for a company to have clearly documented and enforced safety procedures and emergency response protocol. These should then also be backed up and reinforced through ongoing education. This training is based around the Focus 4 and is designed to help keep yourself or your employees safe and in compliance with these top 10 most frequently cited standards. Remember that knowledge and awareness are the first step. It is up to you and your team to enforce and comply with safe work practices. So you're committed to protecting yourself, your coworkers, and anyone else who may happen by from workplace hazards. But it's not enough to just know about dangers. Once hazards are recognized, they must then be communicated. Consider again the Focus 4 and our top 10 violations lists. OSHA has specific guidelines for signs, labels, signals, and barricades to help communicate workplace dangers. It's important that signs and labels or tags be visible, recognizable, and used only when appropriate. These may include laying out barrier tape, the use of instruction, traffic control, or directional signs and tags, cones, caution, and danger signs, exit signs, and other accident prevention signs, signals, and barricades. Dangers from explosive, corrosive, flammable, toxic, or potentially reactive chemical substances also pose significant physical and health hazards across occupations. Unfortunately, many workers use or work around chemicals daily and are completely unaware of the risks or potentially fatal combinations they could form under the right conditions. To help with this, OSHA developed the Hazard Communication Standard, commonly referred to as HAZCOM. The Hazard Communication Standard establishes uniform requirements to make sure that hazard information is communicated to all employees and employers. Under this standard, each company is required to keep a complete and up-to-date inventory of its hazardous chemicals. This list not only identifies all hazardous chemicals on site, it is used to make sure each chemical is accounted for, is properly labeled, and has an up-to-date safety data sheet, or SDS. What chemical health hazards are present in your workplace? You might be surprised as you look around and begin to recognize all that might go wrong. Are there safety labels and other warnings or barriers in place to protect workers? Is there an SDS available for each chemical present? Even simple household cleaning supplies can be dangerous. Just because a person in their own home doesn't use proper PPE when handling a chemical, it does not mean an employee at work should. What is the difference between a laboratory chemist and a master chef? Goggles. Hazard communication practices include both administrative and engineering controls. Administrative controls, also known as work practice controls, seek to decrease the danger from hazards by introducing procedures, policies, training, and sound practices into work culture. Engineering controls are those that are integrated directly into the physical environment through either removal of a hazard or placement of a barrier between potential victims and those hazards. Said another way, they are products and equipment that can eliminate or minimize your workplace exposure. What type of control measures might help keep you safe in your tasks? You must first have a clear understanding of the hazards involved, preferably through well-informed and well-developed job hazard analyses that break down tasks across hazards and how to avoid them. These JHAs should be part of your employer's exposure control plan. Once you and the decision makers at your organization are fully aware of the dangers of your work environment, steps can be taken to integrate in the appropriate control measures. Closely related to HAZCOM control measures are the use of physical barriers and other engineering controls to prevent slips, trips, and falls. Examples include OSHA-compliant guardrails, toe boards, and other physical barriers such as stair railings and handrails, fall harnesses and lines, and also safety nets and floor hole covers. Additional precautions include keeping floors and work areas as clean and dry as possible. Appropriate personal protective equipment should be readily available, in use, and maintained in clean and working order. All required PPE must be provided to workers free of charge. As important as it is for these safety features to be in place, without proper training, they will only be minimally effective. It is an employer's responsibility to train employees about job hazards in a language they can understand, and then to support this training through workplace policies and building a culture of safety. A perfect example of how control measures have minimal effect without proper training and adherence to procedure is lockout-tagout. Imagine you are repairing a piece of machinery with internal moving parts. What is preventing someone else from turning the machine on? Did you flip a breaker, unplug the system, or toggle a kill switch? Each of these efforts are easily undone. Simply shutting off machinery isn't enough. There must be a way to alert others that the energy source in question should not be re-energized. And wherever possible, this should include a lockout device. This is where LOTO or lockout-tagout comes in. In lockout-tagout, the goal is to prevent exposure to what is termed hazardous energy. When lockout-tagout is performed, it is important to identify all energy sources involved with operation of a machine or a piece of equipment. This is not limited to electrical energy, the most common source. It also must include mechanical energy, pneumatic energy, hydraulic energy, stored energy, and also chemical and thermal energy. Whenever any part of the body is exposed to these types of energy while servicing or maintaining equipment, lockout-tagout procedures must be followed. The primary way to prevent the release of hazardous energy during service and maintenance activities is by using energy-isolating devices such as manually operated circuit breakers, disconnect switches, line valves, and safety blocks. Lockout requires use of a lock or other lockout device to hold the energy-isolating device in a safe position to prevent machinery from becoming re-energized. A tagout device is a prominent warning device, such as a tag along with the means of attachment, which can be securely fastened to an energy-isolating device in accordance with an established procedure. As we just discussed, its purpose is to indicate that the energy-isolating device and the equipment being controlled may not be operated until that tagout device is removed. These should be coded or initialed in a way that indicates which specific employees are authorized to apply and remove them. What prevents a tag from being removed? Nothing besides protocol. To add another layer of protection, tags are equipped with the ability to be locked. A tagout device is one that uses a positive means such as a lock, either key or combination type, to hold an energy-isolating device in the safe position and prevent the energizing of a machine or equipment. Sometimes it is not possible to lock out the energy-isolating device associated with the machinery. In that case, you must securely fasten a tagout device as close as safely possible to the energy-isolating device in a position where it will be immediately obvious to anyone attempting to operate the device. Communication is key. It is better to over-communicate when you are working on a piece of equipment that might be turned back on than to regret poor communication later. Approved tags and locks are made of material that is hard to cut through, but people have bypassed them before. Never assume you are fully protected. Check and double-check throughout completion of your task. Usually, lockout-tagout mishaps occur because a worker assumes a lockout device is still in place after an extended break, or when returning to work the following day. The consequences of bypassing or improperly using lockout-tagout are often devastating. Consider your own work environment. In what situations would you want to prevent someone from energizing a circuit or enabling a fuel, hydronic, or pneumatic control? On the other end of lockout-tagout is machine guarding. Machine guarding involves protecting workers from hazards at what is called the point of operation. These hazards can include nip points, rotating parts, and flying chips or sparks. Think about the tools and equipment you work with or around. Are you at risk of amputations, pinch points, having loose clothing pulled into moving parts, or exposure to flying materials or sparks? Examples of machines you might encounter that typically require point of operation guarding include cutters and shears, robotics and other automation equipment, power presses and forming rolls, belt, chain, or shaft-driven equipment, milling machines, power saws and portable power tools, and even conveyor belts, which are used to transport materials from one location to another. Ideally, these machines and equipment will already be equipped with proper guards and safeties. However, all guards require regular maintenance and tightening to be kept in safe operating conditions, and far too often employees habitually defeat machine guards because they believe it makes work easier or more efficient. Well, there is nothing efficient about having body parts amputated or crushed due to improperly guarded equipment. Machine and tool guards should be replaced when they are no longer safe to use. You can determine this through daily visual inspections and implementation of a preventative maintenance and replacement schedule. Other considerations with machine and tool safety include identifying hazards from repetitive motions, travel or toppling over of equipment, tools that cause continuous or severe vibrations, exposure to contaminants from tool and equipment use, and so forth. You, your coworkers, and your employer should continuously work together to identify safer work practices and ways to minimize risk to yourself and others in your work environment. Remember, if a hazard can be identified, the potential incident can be predicted. And if an incident can be predicted, you can guard against injury or illness and be ready for emergency response. Successfully navigating your work environment and keeping others safe in the process also involves a strong situational awareness. Situational awareness is when you understand the interaction of people and equipment in a given environment. It is this lack of situational awareness that often leads to equipment damage and, of course, workplace injuries and fatalities. Machines for which situational awareness is a must are powered industrial trucks such as forklifts and other heavy equipment such as cranes and trucks. Did you ever take a physics class? The more massive the object, the harder it is to get it moving, change its direction, or, often worse in terms of safety, get it to stop once it is moving. With forklift and heavy equipment safety, a basic understanding of physics should be coupled with situational awareness. You must understand things like center of mass, for example. When will a load tip your entire rig over? And also momentum and friction to help determine what slopes and surfaces are safe to travel over, and at what speeds. You must also be aware of the dimensions of the machine as an extension of your body. Some equipment is operated remotely or even autonomously, but often operators are riding in a cab, complete with blind spots, or standing behind the machine. This is where situational awareness comes into play. Injury and death occur because of a poor understanding of the mechanics and bulk of these machines. If you are not certified to operate a piece of equipment, do not get in the machine. Forklift certification alone typically involves lecture and scenario-based training combined with field tests. Do you remember what you had to do to get your driver's license? The process is similar. More specific training for safe forklift operation is available to introduce new operators to forklifts or to refresh the skills of seasoned operators. One phrase that always seems to be on the lips of seasoned employees is to work smarter, not harder. In many cases, they learn this the hard way and are hoping to help you avoid the missteps and injuries that will allow you to protect your most important tool, yourself, from the wear and tear of a career in your industry. Whether you work at a desk, in the cab of heavy machinery, out in the field, at a stationary control panel, with a trowel in your hand, or a pen, career success, longevity, and your long-term health depend on proper interaction with your workspace and equipment. Ergonomics and work practices that avoid unnecessary strain on your body are key to preventing musculoskeletal injuries. Interacting with your work environment goes beyond strains and sprains due to repetitive activities or overreaching. A properly designed workplace will help avoid accidentally flipping switches, pressing buttons, spilling liquids, and other secondary hazard sources, all while improving productivity. It's a win-win. Since hazardous lifting, repetitive tasks, and awkward postures are typically well recognized for established tasks, OSHA's General Duty Clause may apply. However, it is in your best interest as an employee to recognize and report when an activity is causing undue strain or stress on your body. After all, workstations and equipment are often standardized to the average user. Your employer should help you to identify ways to improve how you interact with your own particular work environment. So far, we've looked at several sources of injuries and fatalities, emphasizing falls, chemical hazards, poor communication of hazards or adherence to safety protocol, poor use of tools and equipment, and poor interaction with the work environment. The Focus 4 and OSHA's annually reported top 10 safety violations are born from these. They are the source of lost work time, illnesses, loss of life, dismemberment or disfigurations, seemingly endless legal battles, and potentially huge fines. When an incident report is filed, many questions are often asked. Can you think of some that might be important? How about what safety protocols and controls were in place, and were they followed? What training did the victims and others involved receive? And of course, was appropriate personal protective equipment in use, properly worn, and in satisfactory condition? Personal protective equipment, or PPE, is designed to protect workers from serious workplace injuries or illnesses resulting from contact with chemical, radiological, physical, electrical, mechanical, or other workplace hazards. Examples of PPE include items such as gloves, foot and eye protection, protective hearing devices like earplugs and earmuffs, hard hats, respirators, and full body suits. When we spoke earlier about HazCom, do you remember the difference between laboratory chemists and master chefs? Although both are exposed to eye hazards such as hot fluids and caustic materials, you will not likely be paying compliments to a chef wearing goggles anytime soon. Perhaps that should change. To ensure the greatest possible protection for employees in the workplace, the cooperative efforts of both employers and employees will help in establishing and maintaining a safe and healthy work environment. Let's discuss the responsibility of employers in all of this. An employer is responsible for performing a hazard assessment of the workplace to identify and control physical and health hazards, identifying and providing appropriate PPE for employees, training employees in the use and care of the PPE, maintaining PPE, including replacing worn or damaged equipment, and also periodically reviewing, updating, and evaluating the effectiveness of the PPE program. They also are responsible for paying for and often directly providing much of the personal protective equipment involved for tasks, with some exceptions. For example, your boss isn't likely to buy you a set of sunglasses or a jacket anytime soon and call it PPE. Specifically, OSHA requires employers to pay for personal protective equipment required for compliance with applicable OSHA standards. Do you already own protective equipment that you want to wear? No problem, so long as it is adequate to protect you from hazards at your workplace. That said, any worker's use of PPE they already own must be completely voluntary, and it is up to the employer to decide if your personally owned PPE is appropriate. So, what do employees need to do? Workers are responsible for proper use and wearing of PPE, attending training sessions on PPE, care, cleaning, and maintenance of their equipment, and must also inform a supervisor of the need to repair or replace PPE. Are you or other employees resistant to using personal protective equipment? Think about what the PPE is designed to protect, and then consider what life would be like without that body part, or proper respiratory or other bodily system function. Just use it. PPE is meant to protect individual workers. Protecting other people and the surrounding equipment and building structures is also very important. When hazardous energy sources and reactive substances are not controlled, fires can result. Fire suppression systems like sprinklers may or may not be in place, operable, or effective. Sometimes, workers will need to jump into action as part of emergency response. These are not arbitrary actions taken without planning or preparation. Although all employees should know the location of fire extinguishers, alarms, and fire blankets, specific employees should be designated to use fire extinguishers as part of an emergency action plan. These employees must be trained on how to use fire extinguishers appropriately in their workplace environment. That training must be provided when employees are first assigned these duties, and the training must be reinforced annually. Beyond training, a licensed fire extinguisher service vendor must service extinguishers annually. In addition to annual service, in-house inspections must occur monthly, including verification that annual service and inspection has occurred, ensuring the fire extinguishers are in their proper locations, and also ensuring that they are ready for use by being fully charged and readily accessible. Not all extinguishers are appropriate for every fire emergency. There are various types that are suitable for specific environments and hazards. Full training on fire extinguisher use will include how to physically use an extinguisher and other safety guidelines. As always, prevention comes before emergency response, and communication is always key. If you are performing hot work where fumes and high heat will be produced, be sure to communicate with the proper personnel. This may include facility employees or even the local fire department. This is especially important for sprinkled locations, since water from unintentionally activated fire suppression systems can incur huge financial repair costs, not to mention the dangers the sudden introduction of water in your workspace might produce. Fire suppression is just one aspect of emergency response. First aid should feature strongly in your company's emergency response planning and training. Think back to the list of questions we came up with that might be asked when filing an incident report. We could add another. What first aid was administered? And was it done using the proper precautions by a trained individual? Workplace safety starts with a culture of safe work habits and protocol, and is followed by properly worn PPE. However, when these two layers of protection fail, timely administration of first aid is crucial. OSHA considers first aid to include the cleaning of minor cuts, scrapes, and scratches, treating minor burns and blisters, application of bandages, administering non-prescription medicines, removing debris from eyes, massage, and relief of heat stress through fluids. Are you ready to administer first aid? Can you quickly locate a first aid kit and related equipment at your workplace or job site? Do you know the steps to administering first aid for burns, cuts, choking, and other emergencies? While it's true that some first aid is basic and won't require additional medical assistance, you must also be prepared to provide potentially life-saving first aid to give victims their best chance at survival while waiting for emergency medical help to arrive. We already discussed how every workplace and job task comes with its own set of risks. Exposure to temperature or pressure extremes, chemicals, being entrapped or enveloped by material or equipment, falls, slips and trips, transportation incidents, and even becoming a victim of workplace violence are all potential sources of injury or illness. Each person has their own individual level of risk for certain hazards as well. A person's body mass index, for instance, might be a predictor of how well they hold up to heat exposure and their risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Take a moment to consider your own work environment. What risks are involved? Are you working in or near temperature extremes? Do you work with moving parts or material debris? Does your work involve electrical systems where electrocution is a potential hazard? Regardless of your work situation, there are always health hazards present. Keep in mind that policies and safe work practices are your first line of defense against injury and illnesses. This includes having access to emergency phone numbers and procedural texts. Preparation is key to properly and promptly administering first aid. Step-by-step guidelines for administering first aid are beyond the scope of this training. Your employer should provide you with access to training that is applicable to the hazards you and your coworkers face in your workplace. That training will familiarize you with the types, nature, and application of first aid supplies and equipment, how to assess an emergency situation before administering first aid, and the steps you must take to properly administer first aid. Whether you are administering first aid in an emergency response situation, or if your work simply carries with it an increased risk of exposure, preventing or seeking treatment for bloodborne pathogens is a real concern. OSHA defines bloodborne pathogens as infectious microorganisms that are present in human blood and can cause disease in humans. The potentially life-threatening pathogens include, but are not limited to, the hepatitis B and C virus, often referred to as Hep B and Hep C, along with the human immunodeficiency virus, better known by its acronym HIV. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates 5.6 million workers are at risk of occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens. Are you one of them? Depending on your daily tasks or your likelihood to be on the scene of an injury or administer first aid, your risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogens and other potentially infectious materials may be high. Even simply using tools with sharp or serrated edges used by someone who is infected could pose a health hazard. In many cases, carriers of bloodborne pathogens are undiagnosed and therefore unaware of the risk to others. Having an awareness of risk and how to minimize occupational exposure to these pathogens is crucial. If you ever are exposed or suspect you may have been exposed, you should immediately report this potential exposure to your supervisor and seek medical treatment. Has this training made you think more about the injury and illness risks associated with your workplace? Are you better prepared to protect yourself through the proper use of PPE and emergency response equipment? Hopefully, you are leaving inspired to do your part in building a culture of safe work practices and emergency preparedness. You should ask your supervisor to help you identify the specific hazards you face in your job. Don't hesitate to request additional training in areas where your knowledge and abilities are lacking. This training provided you with an overview of the main hazards and compliance requirements you are likely to face in the workplace. Safety awareness is the first step in a long, successful career.